record to the cloud. And the reason is we've had a lot of people the first day, today and tomorrow, like right now, all of our American colleagues are sleeping. Yesterday, a lot of our colleagues in Europe, parts of Russia and Kyrgyzstan, other places were also sleeping. And so tomorrow will be the same thing. We'll have different folks sleeping in different parts of the world. So what we're doing is all of the sessions are being recorded as long as the chair remembers. And eventually they will be put on, we are redoing the WCA Facebook page. So we'll put them on the Facebook page, and also the website is being revamped, it's being redone. It'll eventually be put on the Facebook and the WCA website, so people can watch the opening ceremony, they can watch any of the panels, and so they can see any of those. And you won't have to have a login to see them, anyone can watch them. So it'll just take us a few, it'll take us a little while to get everything, because if you've ever downloaded a Zoom video, it's huge. So we'll have to, our IT staff will be condensing them and helping us put them online. So once those are online, we'll make sure those are out for everyone to see. So that's one of the things I really like about having the conference this way, is people can engage later and still reach out. Like someone who may not have seen this panel could later on say, oh, I liked something that Audra said, so I'm going to find Audra and email her later. So there'll be engagement later, which I really like. So that's why we're recording the sessions. So our web designer is also looking at YouTube as well. So thank you, Audra. Yes. Audra's known me probably longer than anyone in this room. I think she has. So she keeps me on my toes. So that's the first thing, is I wanted to let you know that's why we're recording. Also, just to introduce myself. Hello, hi, I'm Stephen Croucher. Most of you I know, but if I don't know you, I am the president of WCA, and I am based here at Massey University in Wellington, New Zealand. I also have a dual affiliation with the National Research University Higher School of Economics in Russia as well. So really proud of both places. For me, this is the first conference that I've ran for WCA as the president. And it's really interesting that it's an online one. We had hoped to be face-to-face, but COVID. So we're doing the best we can with this environment. I can say from talking to some of the chairs yesterday, they've already had emails from people who couldn't attend asking for information. So we have had interaction after the fact. So I can say that, which is really nice to hear. So one thing you should know is even if there's only 4 or 5 people, I've been to some NCAs where there's only 4 or 5 people in the room and ICAs. So it's nice to see there is interaction after. I've had a few people already email about the opening ceremony asking for Tina Harris's PowerPoints, asking for information who couldn't be there. So I've actually been pretty happy with the interaction. We have 2 more panels after this one, just so you're aware, and all the Zoom links are on the website. So feel free to please follow those. I will say if you are not a member of WCA, please consider joining so. All the information is online, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. So that's a bit of the logistics, kind of the housekeeping stuff. What we'll do is we're going to go through today in this session is this is looking at a larger research project that the research team and I have been working on here at Massey and throughout the world. So I'll just basically start things off, and then I'm going to turn things over to different people in the room, and I'll have them all introduce each other. So I'll start off with the formal welcome, first of all. Tenakoto, tenakoto, tenakoto. So just to welcome everyone to the session. And so what I'd like to do is, since we're all here, is if I could, I'll name people, and if you could just say who you are very briefly and what university or what your affiliation is, so we can know a little bit about you. It's an important thing that we should be doing, so we know who each other are, and then we'll get into the panel. So I'll go with George first. Can you just introduce yourself and say what your university is, please?
Hi guys, nice to meet you. And my name is George Dean, and I'm a PhD student, and Steve is my primary supervisor. This is my 4th year, and hopefully I can submit by the end of this year. And it's really great to meet you guys here. And my study is mainly about crisis communication, but it's on food safety. Now, my background was from China, and food safety is a big issue over there. And it's a kind of related to public health crisis. So I'm really very happy to stay now to learn from other crises and how to manage this.
Thank you, George.
Cheers.
Audra.
Hi, I'm Audra Deers-Lawson, and I'm a senior lecturer at Leeds Beckett University in the UK. So good morning to everybody. And really, when we're looking for the panel, I'm exploring and have been looking at the reactions and blame attribution with COVID in the UK, because it's quite different from a lot of places. Unlike a lot of places, blame has been pretty much squarely and rightly attributed to the terrible government that we have and to its functional failings and continued failings to protect people here.
Thank you. Elena.
Good evening. I'm here in Wellington, New Zealand at Massey University right now in the office. My name is Elena Maedal, and I work under Stephen, who is my head of school. And I do research in cross-cultural communication and media studies and look at stereotypes and prejudice, mainly from qualitative perspective, but also was taking part in Stephen's larger project on prejudice during COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Tao.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Tao, and this is my second year as a PhD student at Massey University. So Stephen is my primary supervisor, and in fact, I stalked him from Finland because I was one of his master students in Finland. So I am really proud to be one of his students. Up to now, I've been doing research on prejudice and COVID-19 since I came to New Zealand. Yeah.
When we talk more later, we'll talk about the impetus for this project, and a lot of it comes from Tao, actually. So I owe a lot of credit to her. David.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Davide Girardelli, and I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. But for this project, I was basically in charge of helping out on the Italian sample of the whole project. And greetings from Italy. Enjoying nice weather here.
Greetings. Natalia.
Good morning. Glad to see you all. I'm from Russia. I am a senior lecturer at National Research University, High School of Economics in Russia, in Perm. Well, my topic is clarity and immediacy in technology-mediated communication between teachers and students in tertiary education in Russia. And I have my report, my presentation next session. Well, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Joining us. Caroline. You're on mute. You're on mute, Caroline. You can unmute yourself. There you go.
Hi there, I'm sitting in today looking forward to hearing all of these wonderful papers from Australia.
Thank you. Caroline is one of the past presidents of WCA. Elira.
Hi everyone, nice to see you all. I'm from Kyrgyzstan. Now currently I'm in Isiku, it's a mountain lake. And hello, nice weather here. I'm here we are presenting our paper on prejudice and COVID-19 in Russia, Kyrgyzstan, and it's a comparative study. And nice to see you all, and hope you will all enjoy the WCA conference.
Thank you. And Ilira is also our Vice President for Asia for WCA. And forgive me, is it Maud Ukari? Is that correct?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Hi, everyone. I'm Muhammad Kari Ahmad from UST Utara, Malaysia. I'm from Malaysia. And nice meeting you. And thank you, WCA, for the opportunity given for us to participate free for this conference. Nice meeting you all. Thank you.
Wonderful. I think it's nice just for us to see who's all here. So that's why I wanted to go that quick round of introductions. So briefly, what the impetus for this panel is really looking at when COVID struck is, I remember having a conversation with Tao about her doctoral thesis. And at the time she was looking at, Prejudice, international students, and it was a good topic. We liked it. But then she was like, this isn't as significant as what I want to do now. And she was more interested in COVID and prejudice toward Asians. And so we switched. It became much more relevant, much more significant. And so it started this whole journey where a lot of my research track completely changed, looking at prejudice, which I've been looking at before, toward Muslims in Europe, but it switched toward the other, in this case, being those who are blamed for prejudice, or those who are blamed for COVID, sorry, those who are blamed for COVID. And in this case, what you see is that historically, the dominant group always needs someone to blame for something. Normally, the minority is always blamed for something, some ill. And in this case, the ill is this contagion. And so it started this large-scale project where now we have, I think, 20 or 22 countries that we're working in when it comes to either working with collaborators, collecting data via Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey. And we have other countries we're trying to collect data in. So if anyone wants to work with us, please, after this panel, let me know. We're very happy to add more collaborators. What we'd like to do in this panel is really talk about what we've done in Europe. And so what I'd like to do is I'm going to just show you something here. My screen is very messy, I know. But as I now move, is basically, if we look to the panelists, you can see there's, myself, we have Tao and Elena as well from Massey University, David, who's introduced himself, Ilira, who's introduced herself, Tatiana, who cannot be here tonight, from the National Research University, and Audra. And these are just the ones who are working in the European context. And I'm adding in the European context, which probably shouldn't, I'm adding Kyrgyzstan in there, so it's kind of cheating. So it's Europe/Western Asia, kind of. So a little bit of a strange geopolitical context there. Even Russia is Europe, Asia, kind of goes across all. So just forgive me for that. What we're going to do is basically just have this discussion. There's a couple of things. I'll make this a little smaller here. There's a few things we're going to talk about. Is first of all, we're going to talk about why is Europe important for discussion? Like, why is it significant? And the reason I want us to go through that is one of the things we've noticed as we've been going through this research is, and many of you might have seen this if you're trying to submit articles to journals, is reviewers might say, well, why is this context important? Why should we care? Why should we care? I saw this when I first moved to New Zealand. People were like, some reviewers were, and a lot of my staff said, reviewers don't care about New Zealand research. They don't care about the New Zealand samples. And so I think it's important for us to talk about why is Europe important, or Western Asia? Why is it important for analysis? And so I'll let David, Audra, and Ilira kind of talk about why is this region important? Why should we care, basically? And it is just a conversation that we're having during this time. And then I'll talk a little bit about where we've collected data thus far. And then some practicalities of this kind of research. And this is where, Audra, Elena, and I, and then others can also jump in. By practicalities, I mean, really, how do we even collect this stuff? What's all, what are some of the issues we deal with? So then we'll go into some theoretical constructs, and then we'll have some other things. But I'll stop there for now and talk about, first of all, I'll open it up to why should we even care about COVID, prejudice, and Europe? Particularly if we look to say where we're at in this world. It may sound like a duh question to us because we're here at this conference. We clearly care about world issues. We clearly care about communication, being intercultural, international. But I think it's important to talk about why it's significant. So I'll open that up to, David, Audra, and Alira to talk among the three of them. So maybe I'll turn to Audra first to talk a little bit, and then Alira and David, you guys can jump in and talk more about why this is important.
So within a European context, COVID has been quite interesting because I've done a series of crisis panels across from February to June, talking to researchers predominantly in Europe, and not surprisingly, COVID's come up. And what's interesting about Europe is that there have been such different reactions to COVID and success levels of success, and relative failure in the case of the United Kingdom. And this context, because there's been so much discussion, we don't have the same sort of neuroses that the United States does in terms of hating anything official, all the crazy politics in the same ways by any stretch of the imagination. Yet at the same time, there's also, in most countries in Europe, there seems to be a much higher threshold of trust in the government. And David will probably talk about that a little bit in the Swedish context, because even amongst the Scandinavian countries, Sweden has been a bit of an outlier in how they've responded. And other researchers have pointed out that a lot of times it's trust in government all across Scandinavia that has warranted the different responses. But I also think that Europe is quite interesting with regards to prejudice, because as over the last 10 years, as Europe has had to deal with the refugee influx, especially from Northern Africa, attitudes have been changing. We've seen a growing, the growth of the right wing in a number of countries across Europe. And that sows the seeds, I think, for a lot of potential for negativity, for prejudice, where maybe it didn't exist before. So I think that Europe is quite an interesting case study in this regard, because you have, at the same time as generally high levels of trust in government, most countries, UK aside, have managed the disease pretty well, even in Italy, where it was so devastating because it was first. Since then, they have been quite a strong leader in terms of disease containment, management, and how the people there have dealt with it. So there are different sets of issues in Europe compared to pretty much other places in the world. But I think because of the change and the rise of the right wing, there is a potential really to study prejudice, maybe as it's forming or before it forms, to get a good sense of how in this global context it can work.
So, David or Alira, maybe David, since she talked a little bit about, the Sweden and Italy, if you want to jump in, then we'll have Alira jump in. And then, as I said, I wanted to have a free-flowing conversation, which I think is much better than going through the paper and the results and the method, the very standard presentation.
Yeah, well, as for Sweden, I just moved there, so it will be kind of unfair for me to pass, let's say, judgments on Sweden, on the Swedish situation, in particular the political situation, because I have to be honest, I recently moved there, and my involvement in the project was specifically for Italy, because at the time of the data collection, I was during the hard lockdown here. But yeah, to build on Audra's speech, yeah, let's say Italy, in the context of the pandemic, for sure, at one point attracted a lot of attention, and it was one of the epicenters of the pandemic. And it was a kind of a moment also to reflect on let's say, how Italians interact with migrants and the migrant communities. And for sure, let's say, Italy as a country is a kind of a big debate. And as Audra mentioned, also the the right and the far right, there's been a kind of an ongoing discussion. So it was great to have this opportunity to see really how Italians reacted to the pandemic, and in particular towards a particular migrant community that maybe has not received that much attention. For sure, let's say other communities, other migrant communities like the community from Morocco and from Romania, in the Italian academic circles, for sure, they received a lot of interest and attention and consideration. But let's say the Asians, and in particular the Chinese, is a little bit under the radar. And regarding the ITT in particular, we were able to find only one study that basically narrow the attention on the Chinese migrant community. So for this reason, it was a great chance to contribute to an ongoing conversation.
I just put in the chat ITT in case anyone didn't know, integrated threat theory. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes when Tao goes through the constructs. But I liked what you talked about there. If I may, David, follow up on something. I'll jump to Alira about, you talk about how some groups have been studied in the literature really, and some hadn't been. And I can talk about that more in a minute. But Alira, when it comes to Europe, why should people, and I know you and I have talked about this, particularly when it comes to doing research on Kyrgyzstan and Russia, why should people outside, why is it important?
Thank you very much. Yes, it was a really important study, and especially during COVID-19 pandemic in Kyrgyzstan and in Russia, people migrate a lot, especially from Central Asia, from Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan to Russia and beyond to Arab countries, Turkey, and even Europe and US. So during COVID-19, we had a crisis, labor migrants working in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in Russia couldn't go back to their own hometown. They were stuck in Kazakhstan on the border. They lived like refugees for 2 months without even water. So, and when they returned, people were prejudiced toward these migrants, local people. So they didn't want them to let in the country, and they were prejudiced. And also people who went to Mecca and Medina to do religious worshipping, like religious Hajj, they were also coming back, and they were also stuck, and people were prejudiced toward them also, toward religious people who were praying and who were Muslims. And so people had even prejudices toward students studying in China from Central Asia. They also couldn't return, and people were suspicious about them also. So people were prejudiced toward everyone, like except for themselves. So, and it was like COVID changed everything. So, and we tried to survey this, to look at this research question, and it was really interesting to see comparative analysis between Russia and Kyrgyzstan. Both are post-Soviet countries, but still there are differences. But there might be even more differences between Europe and post-Soviet countries. So it was really interesting research. Thank you.
I think that's maybe we'll talk about more in the next steps too, but I think kind of the follow up on some of that is one of the biggest things for those of you who are not on the project is one of the things we've had to do in a lot of the journal pieces we've been submitting is for one of the pieces when we were talking about, Russia and Kyrgyzstan, for example, we did one comparative analysis, is reviewers were saying, well, why is this significant? And it's one of the things we've had to talk about is that so much of the literature is, we don't want to say Amerocentric because we don't want to sound hateful, but you almost want to say Amerocentric. And so much of the literature looks this way and doesn't look at other things. And so we don't understand how our theoretical constructs, how our methodological operationalizations function in other areas. And one of the things that all, that Audra, David, and Alira all talked about are many similar issues that happen in the US and other places, but are happening in different ways or are very different things happening. And so it's really opening people's eyes to things happening in different parts of the world, which is important. And it's a matter of how we articulate that, particularly when, just to be very direct, when you're looking at trying to publish in the SkyMago, the SSCI, the Shanghai, those top journals, is really, that's why I think having that conversation when we put these panels together is really talking about that as more of this kind of understanding how to approach that kind of publishing as well, which for us has been a key issue, is how to deal with those questions. Because we've had even editors refuse things outright because of where the sample comes from, which
Well,
has been
Steve,
really frustrating.
that's a really important point too, because I have found that incredibly frustrating in the last few years. I mean, as you know, my part of my call is to internationalize crisis communication research, because it's a young field, it has been even more American centric than most others. And that's not by any negative reason. It's just that's who happened to be doing most of the research for the first 10 years of the field's existence. But I have had reviews from reviewers and also editors supporting it when I've had a 7-country, all within Europe, all with a rationale for a study, and they've said, why would we care about these countries? And it completely boggles the mind. So this is one of the things I think for anyone doing research that isn't American centric, is partly you have to own it and you have to critique American centric research up front. It may mean that you get a flat rejection, but at the same time it's better, and you can then also educate the editor. In a lot of cases, it's not about revisiting the review, but it's about saying, why would you as an editor make the choice to be American centric? I mean, and this is coming from a couple of Americans, so why would you make the choice?
I haven't lived there for over a decade though.
Ditto. I mean, so there is that. And I think that this is part of it. I mean, yeah, we should be having rationales that offer interesting, like the post-Soviet versus Europe comparison, I think is a really interesting comparison. But at the same time, that should be value qua value, valuable because it's an interesting comparison. And but it's, I think, a matter in the field of more broadly educating largely academics centered in the US, because I think academics outside the US, the question of where, you just need a bit of contextual information to talk about impact. But for academics outside the US, this isn't a question.
Yeah.
It's just trying to expand. And this is also a question for editorial boards. You know, in the journal that I edit, we have internationalized our editorial board for largely this kind of a reason. And I think that this is part of how our field evolves in the next 10 years. Yeah. But you know what, if we can't smack a global pandemic upside people's faces and say, you know what, it's not just happening to Americans, then I don't know what else can.
I think that's why I wanted to bring that up. I think it's just important to, to show that. I also wanted to show everyone this. This is the countries we've been doing research in thus far. And the yellow ones are the ones where we've collected data. And so you have the US, we've done extensive work in South America, one in South Africa. We've got some in Europe. We're a little light in Europe. Asia, we have New Zealand. Blue is where we're in progress. So we also got here, we've got Singapore as well over here. And so in the end, we've also got Cameroon, should be on, Cameroon's over here, Turkey. So we've got some more places in progress. And a lot of it is when we'll talk about the practicalities, we'll talk about really why some of it is taking so long. A lot of it is just because it just takes a long time to collect data sometimes. And so it's also, we're in a time of COVID. And so it takes a while sometimes to get people to do, collect data during COVID. But that's just a little bit more. I'm happy to talk more about that all later, but that's just a bit about, where we're collecting data. And we just, started out really with a few countries we were looking at comparing, particularly the 2 or 3 biggest COVID like countries at first, and then it just kind of added and added and added and added and added and added based upon regions, based upon really cool colleagues and other things too. So it just kind of expanded. So a little bit ad hoc, but in some ways. But then in the end, I would say like some people might argue Russia and Kyrgyzstan is an ad hoc comparison, but it's not. If you think about looking at the post-Soviet, we made a very strong argument as to why one versus the other. It actually does make sense. And so in the end, we really do make good, I think, solid arguments for those. So we can talk more about those.
And this is something that in a different study on vaccination that I'm working on, this is part of our challenge too, is we're trying to figure out, are there fundamental differences in attitudes about vaccination, which obviously, because we have the vaccination, makes a big difference in terms of the long-term management of COVID. And the fact that with this project, you guys have a number of countries in South America means that you can then start to look at some of the worst affected countries. You know, the fact that you can compare the US, UK, Brazil, and India, which arguably are probably the 4 worst in terms of proportion and impact countries. And, you know, early on, that would have been also Italy, but Italy, because they have actually responded well, you know, pandemics happen and then you respond, you know, but that I think is also meaningful in terms of, you know, the more countries there are, the more you can start to ask questions. Are there differences between countries that have responded well? I'm guessing you have less hassle with COVID now in saying, well, hey, New Zealand's an important population than you did before, because New Zealand, at least in Europe, has been pointed out as sort of a gold standard of response.
Jacinda Ardern. Everyone loves Jacinda. Exactly.
But I mean, this becomes, you know, international research, and especially this kind of really big collaborative research, to me is interesting because you can start to ask more interesting questions so that you can, even if the question is about regions that you may not have anticipated thinking, you know, had an a priori reason. We're in the business of developing and disseminating knowledge that hopefully has impact.
Yeah. If we talk about the data collection and like the research, like the issues of collecting research, what I'd like to do is ask, because I know Audra's helped methodologically, Elena's helped methodologically, Ilira has helped methodologically, David, Tao, George on another project has helped as well. But I'm wondering if I can ask, say, Elena, for example, when it comes to, say, the, it wasn't in Europe particularly, but you did help with, like, say, the Russian translation. What is like a methodological issue that you saw when we were doing this kind of, that you just saw when we were doing this, even like with the data that you, me, and Tao did, because it's all really linked to the same thing.
Yeah, so I was involved in coding the qualitative data with the Russian data set and New Zealand data set. And in terms of practicality, we need to take into account the political background. And even the New Zealand data set was quite interesting in terms of the majority of people in New Zealand, yeah, they support Jacinda Ardern, and that's why the second election, Labour Party winning with like a landslide. So that was reflected in the data, because even the question that was asked to all countries, to all participants, why did COVID-19 spread so rapidly? For the New Zealand data set, actually didn't have that much meaning, because I think nearly 1/3 of the participants said it did not. So the question was not that relevant. So we still used it because it's very important, but it clearly showed that the majority of the participants in the data set believe that New Zealand got it quite got much faster in terms of arresting the community transmission. And also, the other thing that I noticed in the New Zealand data set, that there were not many responses sort of indicating any conspiracy theories or hoax, just a couple of them. While we know from the media that so many people around the world in many countries do believe in conspiracies about COVID-19, which was not reflected in the New Zealand data set.
What I was going to ask, though, if you could very briefly, is when it comes to the Russian data we had, because I know you helped code the Russian data, how was that different when it came to, say, a practice? And this is an interesting thing when it comes to collecting data, particularly cross-cultural, is you may have the same question, particularly even if you're coming at it from an outside, an etic point of view, even if you have insiders from an emic point of view. What was one of the issues we found when it came to, say, asking questions about that could be politically linked when we looked at the Russian data, Elena, that you and I were like, well, duh. But it was interesting because we couldn't, because now we can't use it. What can you briefly talk about that?
Yeah, so what happened with the Russian data set, on quite the opposite to New Zealand participants who sort of didn't really blame the government for the rapid spread, with the Russian data set, quite many participants indicated that it was, they blamed the government or the administrative structures for the rapid spread. So instead of sort of going more towards prejudice towards Asians, many participants were very unhappy with the way the government dealt with that. And when we were looking into that, we realized that because of the political situation, we can't really use this data, because though participants were anonymous, still it would raise the questions of how the published sort of research will reflect on the people involved in the project.
It'll affect that. That's what I was going to get at, is we still can't publish. We have to be very careful on what we publish that could be seen as derogatory toward the government, because people like Tatiana and even myself have appointments at a Russian university. So we have to be very cautious of that. And so that's the practicality of research.
And that's in direct, even though the result may be quite similar in terms of UK and Russia in terms of blame attribution, that is an interesting difference where it's something that would be meaty and interesting to explore in the rationales for that. But exactly, I mean, whereas in the UK, you know, moaning about the government is sort of what you do with your morning coffee. So it's there is less than no risk here about that. But I mean, that might be something that even we can address indirectly, that says in countries where blame is squarely on the government, we may be able to look at those indirectly and see if there are some comparisons. So at least using UK as a case example on blame towards the government, we might be able to sow the seeds more broadly, at least within that confines. But yeah, that's a tricky challenge.
That's a methodological challenge. I know, if I may ask David and Elira and Elena, when it comes to like translation, one of the last methodological things I'll ask before I mention it very briefly is, how was it with translating? Because here's the thing, and Tal will mention briefly in a little bit, like, or very shortly, it's like we had a lot of instruments. And so before we had to, we of course did validity analysis, reliability analysis, and that of course was difficult, which I'm not going to get into. But when it comes to translation, can you talk briefly about like, what was that like? Like translating into Italian, Russian, what was that like?
Should I start? I don't want to overlap.
Yeah.
Let's say, broadly speaking, the translation into Italian was straightforward. For sure, I was lucky that I did not have to take into consideration all these aspects that for the Russian sample was kind of problematic in a way, as I understand it. The translation, nonetheless, we had to go through a few quality checks. In particular, I was able to involve three instructors from middle school and high school in Italy to make sure that the language was, let's say, as understandable and comprehensible as possible. And I've been living in Asia for quite some time, and my Italian was a little bit rusty in a way. So it was important for me to somehow make sure that we polished every single word of the translation. But I remember three, let's say, major areas which have been a little bit problematic to translate, if possible. First of all, the idea of race that makes sense when we're studying these type of topics in the United States. But when we're talking about race, let's say in Italy, Italy somehow see the nationalities, not black, but black from Morocco, black from, and the same thing with Asians. It was a term that for people was kind of a complete overlap with Chinese.
Yep.
So they were like, why are you asking me about Asians? They would just, instead when the question was changed to Chinese, people were like, oh, okay, I see it. So that was kind of a dodgy aspect that we need to somehow consider. Secondly, education, because when you have the simple question, what's your level of education? Then you have the American system, the university educational system, then the Italian one, and then the Italian one changed a few times. And considering that this study was open to, let's say, from 8 years old to 18, we had to somehow find categories that were uniform for all these kind of different improvements, if you want, of the Italian academic system. And probably that also created some difficulties because we had to find also the similarities within the system itself. And then finally, the question that was a little bit political. So what's your political affiliation? And that was because of the Italian system with our multi-party, and then they coalesce into 1, 2, 3 polls. You never know; they keep changing. So that was, let's say, taken into consideration. And also, when we analyzed the data only for Italy, we had to combine different parties and try to see, because maybe there is one party that is a populist party, but is now in a coalition with the equivalent of the Democrats. So that was an extra layer of challenge that normally with the American studies you don't need to go into and asking yourself so many questions.
Yeah, it was hard to code the Italian political parties. I remember working with David on that. And I will say, just to move us on, so we've had a great conversation, so we can get a little further, is doing even the Russian translation. I remember that was time-taking. That took a lot of time. And we had a lot of different people working in language departments helping us translate that one. And I still don't think we'll ever get it perfect because it's a further language. The language family is further from English. So I think as further we got, the harder it got. And so that's a practicality you have to think about when you're doing any of this kind of research. And so that's why I wanted to have these kinds of conversations, is to think about that, because then when you're doing a comparison, you have to make sure you're not only talking about reliability of your scales, but validity of your scales, talking about the reliability and the validity of the measurements and all of these things, which it makes the method sections for these kinds of analyses and papers really long if you do them right. It makes them really difficult. What I'd like to do is turn things over to Tao. If she could just briefly talk about which constructs did we talk about, and just talk briefly about those so people know kind of what we measured.
So basically, from the very beginning, we started last year, we started like very small. So basically, we based on the integrated threat theory and the social media richness. And then after we collected some data sets. So we kind of explore that we needed to do more. So that's why we just added more constructs. And now I think our survey has more than 100 questions with different theoretical constructs, from integrated threat theory, even spiral of silence, the fear of COVID-19, and the patient self-advocacy as well. So I think it's kind of interesting because, to me, the fear of COVID-19 serves as a factor who has a really important impact on our constructs as well. For example, like usually, like before, when I read a lot of readings about integrated threat theory, so basically people, we are talking about the intergroup conversation, and people are afraid of the other groups because of some like welfare, physical, material well-being, or even morals, values, or standards that are posed by the out-group members. But now I think that the fear of COVID-19 is bigger. So I think it's kind of really interesting, like when we are doing on this research, the more we do research on this pandemic, so I think it's bigger and bigger, and now it's
yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny when we're in the office, we sometimes just sit there and we're just like, okay, because yeah, we really integrated threats the way we operationalize prejudice, but then yeah, we really brought in this fear of COVID, and at the time there weren't any. When we first started doing this, there weren't any fear of COVID scales. Now there are. But when we first started, they weren't developed yet because, well, COVID just started. And so we modified a fear of HIV/AIDS scale. And we didn't add the new fear of COVID scales because it would have changed right in the middle of data collection. And so we didn't want to do that. We have been hit by a few journals. Why aren't you using a fear of COVID scale? Because we collected data before those scales were out there. That's why. And so it's been interesting to see how fear of COVID, say, interacts with this variable and this variable, and really how it, in many ways, almost it really does, I'd say, in some cases, mediates variables. And it's been really interesting.
Actually, using the kind of the crisis research, you can offer a good grounding for that, because in most cases, the crisis will trump any other factor in terms of contributing to fear and uncertainty. So in crisis research, we see very few significant differences when you start asking about culture, when you start asking about gender, when you start asking about, you know, the normal variables that you would expect to see affecting, because it's quite frankly, it's the crisis that matters, which, you know, for a crisis person does a body good. But so I think part of that argument that if you get hit with a reviewer that moans about that, I think a way to preempt that is very much about saying, look, the crisis literature has a basis for this, that what matters is the crisis. This is the operational assumption that we're making.
And that's really cool, because we're finding, and Tao can correct me on this, but typically the demographic variables, because we do ask, you know, sex, you know, we do ask, you know, age, we do ask you know, all the normal demographic questions. They have no real impact. We put them in, say, you know, if we do a structural equation, if we do a multiple regression, whatever, they have no impact whatsoever. Really, what's impacting is people's fear of COVID, which we've labeled the contagion effect. It's really this idea of the contagion. But even the crisis literature, I would say, is flawed in this case, because most of the crisis literature looks at an organizational crisis, not like a crisis like this, or at least the ones that we've read don't look at it the same way that would help us the way that we could. But Audra could school me.
Yes, because actually, while you see a lot of researchers like Tim Coombs and the folks who use situational crisis communication theory and and that, yeah, they only care about the organization. However, there is, I would say, a much more significant portion of the crisis community now who is looking at stakeholder attitudes, and so people affected by crises. So if you took a look at more of the research coming from, say, Yan Jin, from the Cell Nows, so idea model, anything with that focuses on people. We actually don't care so much about the organization. Yeah, reputation is an interesting thing to measure, but it's mostly about the stakeholder-centered research. So I would argue that, yeah, you're right, that a lot of the foundational crisis lit is much more organization-centric, but especially post-COVID, because good Lord, everyone is a crisis researcher these days. But post-COVID, though, even in the crisis community, the turn that a lot of us were making to saying, okay, we don't care so much about the organization, we care about people affected by crises. That turn has been, I think, amplified in the last year or so. So when you're looking at emotion in crisis, there's been, since about 2010, a lot of good research that's looking much more at people's reaction to crises rather than organization.
That's why whenever you put together a research team, you put people together who are smarter than you to help you out and who can add to you in different ways. Crisis communication, Audra is by far much more advanced than I am. So that's why she is part of our team. So always bring people in who know different things than you do, which is important. When it comes to, I would just say, when it comes to what we've been doing, just a couple of points, and then we'll open things up for a general discussion, is it's been really kind of cool. We actually published a piece in Italian, which was really awesome. So David, that was really awesome. It was really cool working on that. So really, kudos to him. So high five to him on that one. But that also came from really, it fit the context. And so what I'd recommend for folks is this, is in this case, it really will have more impact. I think that piece will have more impact in Italian than it will in English, in, say, a very low-level English language journal. I think the piece and the findings will have more impact there because more people will read that. It's also in a political science journal. So I think it'll be more impactful there. So a conscious decision was made in that case to go that route. I think it'll be better suited there. And so that I'm really excited about that. So it's really kind of cool for me to have something in Italian, which is really awesome. But David's the lead star on that, which is great. And recently, Ilira and Tatiana and I did something on Russia and Kyrgyzstan, which has just been done. And we've got a couple of other pieces on the European data that are in progress. It's just when all the data is being collected, it's a matter of how do you parse out all that data and figure out what to do. Because I will say, doing a large scale cross-cultural comparison, it's a hard sell for a lot of the journal editors, particularly when they're demanding you compare each country on, say, Hofstede or Hall, or that's what they're demanding. And those of you who know me know that that's not how I work. Particularly in this case, where I wouldn't say that impacts how we respond to COVID. That there's other issues, but this is what Audra was talking about earlier, how to educate the editors in this case on why that's not important, why the impact of, say, COVID, the government response. But if you're talking, say, about 5 countries, the context becomes so long that it almost becomes hard to write one article. So it's becoming difficult. We're trying to find ways to do this. A lot of our time is spent talking about what is the next piece and where do we go next? And that's the hard part. But it actually makes it interesting because the research group, I would say, that's what I would encourage you to do, is if you find a good project and you get a group of people together, collect enough data with each other that you can actually have a lot of papers for quite a long time. I'm happy I don't have to collect any more data, and neither do a few of my co-authors for the next couple of years. We've got plenty of things we can work on, which is great. And so that's really the future steps for us, is to keep working on not only the prejudice research, but as Tao said, the spiral of silence, to going more into the political aspect, which would be really interesting looking in the post-Soviet, context and other areas. But always looking for collaborators, so please get in touch if you want. But I'd like to open it up now for general discussion and general questions, thoughts, ideas. So, panelists jump in, thoughts, jump in ideas, say things I may have left out, other thoughts, attendees, anything. But basically, I just wanted to get this together to really say that, we put together a group to really focus on this region. And while it's been beneficial for us, it's not been easy. There's a lot of methodological challenges. There's a lot of journal challenges. It's also challenging now with, Zoom all the time. So it's hard to sometimes get people together across time zones. But it's also been really beneficial. It's also been really fun as well. And one of the last things I'll say is this actually important work. I would say it actually makes a difference. One of the things I said recently is of all the work I've done over my career, I would say one of the pieces I'm the most proud of is a piece that was published last year with Tao and Diaco in Frontiers. Not an SSCI journal, not Shanghai or anything, but the journal, it's got over 30,000 views thus far. On how many downloads. It was cited in the New York Times, Washington Post, South China Morning Post. And because it was about prejudice toward Asians in the US, and it talked about what the problem is, how it's escalating, practical solutions. And so for me, it's a matter of do what you're passionate about, work with people you want to work with. And that's why I wanted to show here as a case where that's what we're doing. And it branches off where now I know Audra's working with people here at Massey in different ways. And so they've connected in different ways, but it can feed off and people meet each other and they start doing their own things as well, which is also great. So it's kind of that thought incubator. So that's it for me. Others, jump in.
Well, Stephen, what you're talking about is something that actually on a project that I'm working on with some colleagues around Europe and in the US, we just had our kickoff 2-day workshop last week. And this was a point that we were making too, was that it's more important than ever that the work that we do in communication, I mean, ours is a crisis project, but the work that we do in communication isn't necessarily reaching the people who are making decisions, the people who are in health arenas who need this information. And so, what we're talking about on that project, what you're talking about on this one, and I think on a number of projects that I think a lot of us are working on, is frankly, we need to be more conscious of the SEO. I mean, it sounds a bit cheesy, but we need to think about how we collaborate, the associations that we're working with. I'm doing some work now with the Asia Europe Foundation and also with the World Health Organization on this kind of translation of academic information into realms that can help policy, help health practice, because while it's getting published in some fabulous quartile 1, 4-star, whatever, and my love of these things is clearly coming through, I think they're rubbish. I think these supposed, yes, you want to publish in quality journals that have quality, peer review processes, and it's rigorous and this and that. But the academic obsession that has emerged in the last few years about impact factors, about all of this kind of stuff, means that we are not translating our knowledge in a usable way. We are writing for each other. And I think that's going to be, especially in a lot of countries where funding for higher education is being questioned, where there is less and less research-based support. A lot of us will be in fortunate positions in this case, but that's certainly not the case globally. And if we're not being able to show a translation from research to publication to impact, and not because the journal has a high impact or a high, insert cheesy measure, false measure, academics getting together and deciding which journals they like the best, mostly old dusty academics. In the case of the business journals, the ABS list is old dusty, largely white men get together and decide which journals matter. Really? But so I think these kind of international collaborations, I think, are the way forward. Not as, yes, for publication, because the sheer volume of data we can collect is ridiculous, but also for creating connections with associations, with political organizations, health organizations, whatever types of organizations are relevant. So that's my pitch and my critique of academia all at once.
Yes, I agree with Audria. Academicians should go out of the box, out of the walls of the universities, where what they feel like in an aquarium, detached from society. And I think COVID made them to think how we can go to society with our research, how we can contribute to the development of society, and not for just writing with each other, attending conferences and just discussing about things that are very abstract, and how to go down to earth. I mean, with your health research, with communication research, with crisis management research, how we can help people's everyday life out of the academia. Yeah, so social impact and civic engagement of universities. And this in here, participatory research will help. Doing research with your own, with your respondents, including them, inclusive research, so that they can also design the methodology of the research, be inclusive and participate in data collection and contribute to the research. I think that the future will be like that, participatory research, yeah, so that we can engage publics in academia, also to create content, to put the agenda, to participate in decision making. So this can academia contribute to citizens of their countries and globally also. And so I think that this kind of research is really engaging.
Mohammed, I think that's my news.
Yeah, I think that this is very interesting studies, and I think I've learned a lot. And I'm just would like to get your experience in dealing issues with. I believe that when talking about crisis, at the very beginning, the perceptions will be a bit different, and in the middle and towards the end. So how, I mean, that in terms of your data collections time frame, because I believe that like in Malaysia, for example, at a very early stage, we have quite a negative prejudice towards the Chinese, because we were believed that this virus caused by the Chinese. And then after a while, when we found a huge, very huge numbers of group of people who are affected from this disease, and came from a gathering by Muslim groups throughout the world, the Tabligh groups, and then we shift the prejudice towards this Muslim community. So I would like to know how you handle issues such as the time frame of data collections in order to understand the real prejudice that you have. That's the first question. The second, I think that I do agree, and really, I mean, that admire what Audra has mentioned just now. We need to actually transform our research, our findings into a more practical in terms of how the society actually can benefit it. So in this regards, how your team plan to translate this finding into something that really useful for the community? Thank you.
Well, I answered the first one. Well, thank you for that. The first one is a great question. Is like, I'll give you an example of Brazil, because it's an easy explanation. Is the first group that was blamed for were meat packers, people who were people who worked in meat packing plants were the first ones who were blamed. The second group were Asians. The third group is when we started data collection. So what we did was, when we started the data collection, we were actually analyzing the newspapers, talking with a colleague who speaks Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese. And we found out at that time, when we started data collection, we altered the outgroup. So we changed the person who's identified in the survey to pretos, P-R-E-T-O-S, pretos, which is blacks. It's the colloquial form for blacks. And so at the time of data collection, we said we were looking at how the predominantly, lighter skinned Brazilians prejudiced pretos. And so we identify who it is. And at the time we collected data in Mexico, it was about, if I'm correct, Tao, it was about Americans, because that's who they were blaming. They were blaming the Americans who were coming over for spring break and basically causing all the COVID. And so it really is, when we collect the data, before the data goes out, we basically say the data needs to be collected within this period, or else we know there's problems. In Finland, we know the data is taking a while, but fortunately, thus far, knock on wood, the outgroup hasn't changed. So we're watching that very carefully. In Turkey, the outgroup hasn't really changed. So we're watching if the outgroup is changing, and if it changes, we stop data collection, because then we have to focus on the one group that's in the survey. That's the key thing, just from a methodological point of view. But that is important. We also have to make sure in the article we say data was collected during this time, because then they can go back and say in the news, because we can argue a lot of this is through framing. And if we wanted to get into the media side, how it's framed. I just worked with a student of ours who does data analytics, and it was so cool. They downloaded every one of Donald Trump's tweets, which was kind of scary, but every one of Donald Trump's tweets in 2020 that dealt with COVID, and they did a sentiment analysis using natural language processing. And they're now doing the same thing for all the G7 leaders. But the time frame has to be very clearly set, and they're looking at how that framing impacts who we identify as an outgroup in each country. And so you just have to be very clear on what your time frames are. The second thing is how we articulate it. Well, for me, one of the big things is here in New Zealand, one of the things I'm doing with the New Zealand research, so not as much yet with the European one, but because I have the connections here, is anytime we do a study on COVID in New Zealand, like we just finished one with two of my colleagues, not on prejudice as much, but kind of is, looking at how those who can get vaccinated prejudice those who can't, or prejudice those who won't. And we just submitted that piece for review. But when the piece was finished, I then altered it to a 2-page. Sorry, I transferred it. I altered it to a 2-page white paper and submitted it to our Ministry of Health. And so more and more of that is happening, particularly of those types of analyses. And Audra's gonna laugh, but some of the stuff in Europe is, I was asked about 6 months ago to submit some research and some information to the NHS in the UK on prejudice. And so I've been sending small documents, like 2 pages, 3 pages. And so I think more of those kinds of things, but it's unfortunate you have to be asked and have that in. But maybe that's good, because you don't want a crazy person who has really bad methods and all these things. But I think that's what we're doing, is doing that. And maybe we're not all doing it, but I think I'll just take the lead, and I'm doing that on behalf of the project. And I'm happy to do more of that. And now that that's happening, I'll reach out to more of the team and say, this is how we can do it. But that's a new thing developing, which is really nice to do. Yeah, it's really cool, actually. In New Zealand, one of the great guys we have here, you may have heard of Michael Baker, who's on the radio and television all the time. He's been on BBC everywhere. And he's one of the biggest ones talking about our COVID response. And I've actually sent some of our documents to him to really look at and things like that. So it's been really kind of cool to interact with those people who are always on television, and kind of, been kind of cool.
Well, this is also the benefit of being in smaller countries too, is I think that some of the access to people is more ready than if you're, like if you're in the US, you're one of 300 million, and unless you have a specific connection to the CDC or something like that, which we may do, because there's so many communication researchers, PhDs from that we may have personal connections with, but outside of that, it can be harder. But if you're, and this is, I think, part of the trick is, who do you know? Well, the fewer people there are, the more chance there is to know folks.
Mm-hmm. The other big thing too is, and this is something that I'll just say, I know that I have that benefit to do this, but I can publish some pieces in open access journals that don't count much for impact. But like the Frontiers paper, we just had another piece published in Frontiers looking at how hand washing and face mask wearing differed before and after the US election. And so we did a longitudinal study. And what was really interesting is we can track on Frontiers who's viewing the papers. And we recently looked and we found that it was viewed 35 times in the US Capitol, which tells us that someone is reading, either some Republican or some Democrat is reading that. So some policymaker or some intern is reading that. But that's one of the benefits of open access as well, is it's free, people to read immediately.
And that's also with Frontiers is interesting because I was just on a project I was just doing, because we are looking at self-protective behaviors because of the rapid review. And this is where I think Frontiers has already the mechanisms for doing that. But I've also noticed a lot of journals are right now trying to do rapid review, more rapid review and online publication. Before the volumes and issues are out, all of that kind of stuff, because quite frankly, it's about getting information out as quickly as possible. So it's a really good time to be doing this kind of research right now.
Yeah, it is, because normally a journal you'll get a piece accepted. Most journals that are affiliated with the publisher will have a 6-month to an 18-month moratorium on the full piece. And now a lot of them are abandoning that, which is great, or at least shortening that. But even then, that's one of the things too that we can try to do. So there's lots of different things, and I'm happy to talk more, but I also don't want us to go too late on this because we have the 7:30 panel coming up. But what I'd like to do is really for me, I have to thank not only those who are part of this journey that we're on, but really thank you. And it's going to keep going. But also for those who came in just to, chat with us and participate, thank you so much. And we do have a 7:30 panel coming up as well. So please do, participate in that one if you can. So basically 7:30 New Zealand time, sorry. But in 15 minutes, we have a panel coming up. I'm sorry, I'm stuck on NZ time. But we have a panel in 15 minutes. So the Zooms are all there. And really, please, we will have all the panels and paper presentations online. Tomorrow, we will have the closing session. And we will have a great speech, a keynote from Walid Afifi. And if you don't know, Walid is the incoming president of NCA and is amazing to listen to, is absolutely amazing. So his work with Palestine and Israel, for example, and his work on resilience is just awesome. So I'm really excited he actually accepted my offer. So I'm really glad he's going to be speaking with us. So that will be tomorrow as well. So I look forward to seeing you all. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email. If you're interested, send me an email or just want to chat, let me know. But enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy your evening. I hope to see some of you again at 7:30. So, and you got my stuff last night, David, so we're all good. So, and we'll see you all soon. So, all right. Cheers, everyone. I can, Ming, yes. Actually, I will send that to you, Ming. Yeah, I will.